Hi everybody, we're going to wrap up this chapter on the muscular system with ATP generation for muscle contractions. In your course pack, this begins on page 90. First, we need to go back and discuss what ATP is. We know it's an energy molecule and it's a type of nucleic acid. Because it's categorized as a nucleic acid, we know it's built from a nucleotide. Now, the adenosine portion is the nitrogenous base of that nucleotide. There are 3 phosphate groups here, so those letters ATP come from adenosine triphosphate. Now, when we need energy, we can remove one of those phosphate groups, allow it to do energy and work for us, and then it can be reconnected back with ADP, which is a lower energy form known as adenosine diphosphate. So the higher energy form is adenosine triphosphate. That's like having money in the bank and a credit card, ready to go, or a debit card ready to go. However, if you've got ADP, then that's like having a low energy level or no money in the bank. So we need to rejoin ADP with the phosphate in order to create the high energy form, which is ATP. Here you can see the adenosine triphosphate a little more closely. You can also see a sugar here, ribose, which is common with, of course, RNA molecules. Now, we're going to talk about 3 ways that your body generates ATP. Aerobic respiration is our first type. Aerobic means with the use of oxygen. This particular type of cellular respiration is the classic form that occurs in the mitochondrion using 2 reactants, glucose and oxygen, to make 36 or approximately 36 ATP molecules. Now, if this was gas mileage, this would be pretty good bang for your buck. Getting 34 to 36 ATP molecules per glucose is a great, efficient way to make ATP. There's one catch, however. You have to be breathing and breathing properly to get enough oxygen in to make this. So you do this form of aerobic respiration when you're at rest. Here's the equation for aerobic cellular respiration. The ingredients or reactants needed to make ATP are glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen. The waste products here are carbon dioxide and water. So, in fact, your respiratory system serves the mitochondria by bringing in oxygen and removing the carbon dioxide. That water that's made, it's called metabolic water, and it's not enough for you to live off of. But the real winning thing here that we're looking for is around 34 to 36 ATP. That is the goal of this whole entire chemical reaction. There are 3 steps of aerobic cellular respiration. We're not going into detail here. I just wanted to mention that glycolysis is the first portion, and it's actually an anaerobic step, meaning without oxygen. Only 2 ATPs are made during that anaerobic step, and in fact, we could stop there and not proceed through the rest of this chemical reaction. If it does proceed, then that goes through the Krebs cycle, and then finally to the electron transport chain, where around 34 total ATPs are made in that last step. So if you count all 3 steps, that's how we come up with a number of around 36 ATPs. It's in that 3rd step, the electron transport chain, that oxygen is required. Now, the second way to make ATP is called direct phosphorylation of ADP. Keep in mind that ADP is the low energy form, and we need to join it with a phosphate group to make ATP. ATP is the preferred higher energy form. We can use creatine phosphate, which is available in our muscles, to join with ADP to make that ATP molecule. So I'm just going to put here for that phosphate CP, which stands for creatine phosphate. We can take that phosphate off of there and give it to ADP to make that ATP. Now, the unfortunate thing here is this only lasts 10 to 15 seconds as exercise begins. This is not a long-term, nor is it an efficient way to make ATP. If this was gas mileage, it'd be like getting 1 mile per gallon off of your reactant. Not a very great way here to make energy. So this type of chemical reaction that occurs does so in muscles, initially when you start to exercise, and it's a really short-term way to maintain ATP production. Here you can see we take the phosphate off of creatine phosphate. We join it with ADP to create ATP. And of course, we create this waste product here called creatinine. You may have heard of that that before, creatinine can be removed by your kidneys and it will show up in your urine. So if you're exercising after around 15 seconds, the ATP reserve supplies and your creatine phosphate supplies are gone. So at this point, we start manufacturing ATP through an anaerobic method. That's that first step of aerobic respiration called glycolysis. Now, this process means that there's not enough oxygen being delivered to your mitochondria. So they simply take glucose molecules and transform them into ATP. Only 2 ATP are made per glucose molecule. We can actually use glycogen, which is stored in our liver and muscles, and we can also then burn fat. But again, all of these are broken down into ATP without the presence of oxygen, so the efficiency here is not very good. But if you want to lose weight, then this is the way to do it, because only will you tap into fat supplies with this third step. So let's review. Of the 3 types that we've talked about so far, the form of ATP generation that makes the most ATP is our first one. It's called aerobic cellular respiration. The form that makes the least ATP is called creatine phosphate, and I'll just put CP there for an abbreviation. Painful lactic acid may be formed if you only perform anaerobic respiration. That's in the absence of oxygen. Anaerobic respiration is also responsible for turning glycogen into glucose and further on into ATP. Aerobic respiration is used simply during rest. And during heavy exercise, of course, we tap into our anaerobic respiration pathway. So if you experience muscle fatigue, you may be missing one of these major ingredients. You have to have blood, oxygen, ATP, and no structural damage in order to have muscles function properly. If you're missing one of these, the muscle may become fatigued and will not respond to stimuli. So let's talk about an example where this may occur. If somebody's running a marathon, you may have seen a person fall across the finish line, and you may think it looks rather dramatic. But in fact, they may have just finally fatigued their muscles to the point where maybe there's not enough oxygen or ATP available. Or if someone's running and tears a muscle, that muscle now has damage. That too could cause muscle fatigue. This last term here is very fancy, but it's a rather simple process actually. It's called excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. Let me put it to you this way. If you've ever climbed the stairs in the 5000 building on main campus, by the time you reach the 3rd or the 4th floor, you're probably breathing pretty heavily. You are now in oxygen debt. You're breathing hard, trying to get enough oxygen for your mitochondria to make ATP aerobically. So you're going to breathe heavily until you can repay your oxygen debt. Several minutes after you land on the 4th floor of the 5000 building, you'll finally start breathing normally again, but only after you repay your oxygen debt. Until you can do that, your body's going to use anaerobic respiration to make ATP. Keep in mind, that's not very efficient, but it does help to break down fat reserves if you burn through your glucose, then glycogen, and then you tap into your fat supplies. So we think of this as a way for us to make sure we get enough oxygen into our bodies before we transition back into aerobic cellular respiration.